Good morning. Welcome to INSA's Coffee and Conversation with Scott Bumgarner. Before we begin today's program, we'd like to share a video from our sponsor. And now please welcome INSA Vice President, John Doyon.
Good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Coffee and Conversation. This morning, we're pleased to welcome one of our community's top leaders to our program. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions, and we hope you do, please submit them to the questions box on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions. We are pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today, so this is a reminder that this program is on the record. And finally, I'd like to thank our program sponsor, SAIC, for their support of today's program. It's my pleasure now to introduce Gavin Green, Director for the IC at SAIC, who will introduce our speaker. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you, John. On behalf of SAIC, I would like to thank INSA for holding today's discussion. SAIC is delighted to work so closely with the IC and specifically the ODNI. We realize that the challenges that the community is facing in meeting evolving threats and problems, we are heavily invested in developing and delivering solutions that meet the new ways of delivering capability. For instance, our Rugged Apps offering is taking commercial apps useful for warfighters and the IC, securing them, making them available through app stores for federal use. We also have developed a seamless automated capability to search and retrieve data on an unclassified environment from a classified environment. SAIC is always exploring better ways of doing things, and I can't wait to hear today's comments. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Scott Bumgarner, who serves as the IC Senior Procurement Executive. In this capacity, he leads efforts to improve contracting and procurement across the IC by providing oversight in contractual matters affecting execution of acquisitions, fostering a well-qualified contracting workforce, and encouraging the development and implementation of procurement policies and practices. Previously, he served as the Deputy Chief Strategy Officer at the CIA, where he helped lead the enterprise-level risk strategy, corporate governance, targeting, enterprise risk, and business analytics functions for the agency. Scott, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
No, thank you so much, Gavin. I'm really honored to be invited today, and I also want to thank MITRE Corporation for providing the facilities here because I don't have a unclassified setup back where I work. So
nice.
This exchange is really vital to me to successfully carry out my role because when you look across the 18 agencies that form either entirely or partly the intelligence community, about 80% of the budget is spent in some way under contract. The good news is we have a lot of professionals that are extremely dedicated to their job and they're taking this very seriously. But we also know that in order for us to be successful, there's some fundamental changes that we have to make. And so I think recognizing that the need to make those changes is the first step in our self-help discovery. I've been doing this for over 3 decades, and I have never seen the level of attention given by senior leadership on this topic. I've been in the role for about 8 months now, and I think 3 months into the role, I was summoned to Director Payne's office to have a chat with her because I think anecdotally she had started hearing stories, particularly on emerging technology, but not limited to emerging technology, where the pace of the technology that we are increasingly so interested in, and it's so vital to us to be relevant in the future, the pace of technologies is proceeding at a pace that is faster than our budget and acquisition cycles. That's obviously incompatible. When you throw on the fact that, like so many organizations, COVID has accelerated a real retention problem that we've already had prior to COVID, but has exacerbated. Across the board, when I look at a typical agency in the community, if you look at the contracting workforce, we're about 20% under strength. Worse than that is, even for those that are in the positions, if you look at the relative experience level by any historical benchmarks, it's woefully short of what it is. So when you couple those things, not only do we have a fundamental problem just getting contracts executed, but there's some other cultural phenomena that start creeping in at an accelerated pace. One of them is risk aversion. For those that have been in the community for some time, that's not a new concept, but it's really deafening. And in order to do the very things that we know we need to do, the overly risk-averse posture is simply incompatible. So we've got some heavy lifting to do to change that whole culture. We have some creative options out there of how to bring emerging technology in sometimes, but then when it comes to handing it off, we sometimes let it die on the vine. So we've got to, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with some of the questions that I know have been posed, but I think there's a need for this middle ground to kind of have a pathway to those that are very energetic, excited, intrigued with some of the great technologies that we know we need to integrate into our functions. But yet, how do we actually create a pipeline where we actually bring this into major systems or even operationalize them at all in some cases? It's two different individuals, and again, culturally, there seems to be a divide at some point. So that's another fundamental part of this. So there's many facets to the term reimagining acquisition as we've coined it. And again, I'm excited to have the opportunity to chat with you about this. Another part that is so integral to everything that we're going to say is reducing barriers. We know that they're out there. We do have some viable ways for classified contracts, whether it be embracing the concept of SCIF as a service, or even turning to you and maybe coming up with easier approval processes so that you can turn some of the SCIF space that maybe be underutilized, particularly in the COVID era, turn that from a cost center into a profit center by not necessarily having your competitive rivals lease that space, but some of the emerging companies that are geographically all over the country that we would like to be exposed to classified work, to give them a more ready approach to that if you are willing to partner with them. So I think there's so much that we can do. We'll talk a little bit about today. Where I came from, CIA, traditionally, when we had a new contract, we would assume everything has to be at the upper classification level. I think that COVID has, once again, even though it's obviously a negative in aggregate, there have been some benefits that have accrued from that. One is, by sheer necessity, we've had to, across the community, realize that not all parts of the work need to be at that higher classification level. And when you change the whole complexion of what can be done at an unclassified or a lower classified level, you fundamentally change the marketplace of who can perform the work, and that is exciting. Obviously, there's an integration challenge that goes with that, and so I'm not downplaying the significance of that, but that's part of the solution that someone on this phone call can perhaps help us in the future. So I know you have some questions that you wanted to pose, so I'm ready.
Yes, thanks, Scott. Thanks for those comments. A lot there to think about and to delve into a little bit more. Sort of going back to the top, you talked about some of the challenges, especially speed, where technology is going, and the pace is so much faster than the acquisition process that is in the government. So I know we've talked a little bit ahead of this call today. I know you're working on a new vision for acquisition in the IC that could help address this, the speed question, the speed of acquisition. And so I'm curious, as you work on that, what about some of these ideas of changing the culture to embrace fast failure so the IC can learn and adapt more, or looking at ways to reduce one of the classification barrier, doing more unclassified work that can still be pertinent to the IC mission? What are some of the key challenges as you really tackle this speed question that you're facing?
So there's obviously multiple dimensions to that question. When I think about what commercial practices are like in Silicon Valley or even outside of Silicon Valley, fast failures is a cultural phenomenon that sounds to many in government is the most counterintuitive concept that they can imagine, and it gets back to that risk aversion posture, because we have over decades, and it served us well in some cases, but we have actually created a culture where failure is either not an option or it's highly frowned upon, and career it can be career devastating. We've got to change that. We have to realize that when you deal with something like quantum computing, for instance, that's still in its nascent stages, you're going to have failures. But yet, if we fail to embrace the promise that a technology like that offers the community, we will be woefully left behind and frankly irrelevant going forward compared to our adversaries. So we have to be able to take that approach, particularly on technologies where there's going to be commercial applications, there's going to be intelligence community applications. I think we have to learn what commercial industry is doing. I think we can learn a lot from venture capital firms, how they allocate their funding. They realize that not all of these are going to be winners. So I think we have to spread our options among promising technologies, promising companies, small ventures. In-Q-Tel is one avenue to do that, but not the only one. The CIA labs, the collaboration that they are going to promise, but that's still a nascent capability, is just another example. IARPA is an exciting area where we can try to bridge some of that, but we've got to really change that risk proposition. That's not an easy thing to change. I think the senior leadership can articulate their willingness to embrace that, but frankly, I think the change is going to have to be done at each IC element and at the not just the senior management ranks, but the middle management as well. And that's going to have to get into all facets of how we evaluate employees, how we celebrate failure sometimes, because even with a failure, even though it didn't go exactly as we had hoped, there's almost invariably some powerful lessons learned that can be applied to something else. So that's going to be a tough one to crack, but there at least is a willingness to do that now. And I think that's at least a first step, by no means the only step.
Back to this idea of speed, where do you see that you're having some success in trying to, increase the speed of acquisition? Have you been able to, find any avenues to do that yet? And can you tell us about them?
So it's, like I said, I've been doing this for 3 decades. I think I've been hearing about speed for 3 decades.
Exactly.
And I'm sure it's 3 decades prior to that. So there's lots of different reasons why things take as long as they have. And again, the tradecraft is an important element of that. And it's not just the contracting officers, it's the contracting officer technical representatives, the program managers. It's the way we do market research is, I'll just point to one example, is sadly an area that was considered a chore. And it's like, we got to go and divert some of our attention to this. But I think it's so powerful, because in order to even understand what's in the realm of the possible, it starts with understanding the marketplace, understanding how to depict your requirement. Sometimes we have very, what am I saying sometimes? We almost always have very concrete ideas of how we think the acquisition should proceed, but having done that market research, we realized there actually might be a better option that's already commercially viable out there that meets 87% of what we need, and we have a workaround for the other 13%, or even the 100% that we thought we needed, we actually don't need. But the market research is something that's been woefully neglected. So I really want to change the whole culture of how we use that and not look at it as a burden, but look at it as a liberating aspect of the acquisition cycle. Because we're just not doing this. We need to couple that with business acumen and understand what drives the marketplace. Sometimes we just feel like we are the only customer out there. When we can increasingly deal with dual or multi-use technologies, we are a tiny sliver of the market that a particular company we're interested is pursuing. We have cumbersome processes. We have efforts to try to alleviate some of that through other transactional authorities, the CSO authorities that DoD now has, the commercial solutions option. Give the promise of non-FAR-based contracting writing. As you can imagine, when we have a workforce that's steeped in FAR-based contracting writing, we have to actually buttress their training just to make them aware of how to go through that. So the authorities are part of the solution, and there's been a lot of focus now on, do we have the right authorities? I actually think that we have a tremendous amount of authorities that are either underutilized or not utilized at all. But even for the new authorities, like the two I just mentioned, there has to be a training component to it, because having the authority, but then how to do it in a legally viable way, in a savvy way, are two different things entirely. So we are trying to bridge. We have an agency that is trying to use other transactional authorities for the first time. We brought in individuals from DARPA, for instance, to help them, someone that is steeped in it.
Yeah, I was going to say, along those lines, another thing that has been around for a long time, but perhaps isn't used as much as it could be, or perhaps should be, is encouraging contracts to look at statements of objectives rather than just statements of work. And I've heard this, as I'm sure you had for many, many years, but we still haven't been able to really change that paradigm. It's like there's a comfort zone with statements of work. People understand it more. Statements of objectives are a little bit less familiar, but they're also, supposed to be, a better way ahead. So how do you work on shifting up, people's attitudes and the culture, and getting, really the idea of promoting outcomes like the statements of objectives would?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I'll just say right off the bat, I'm not a supporter of a one-size-fits-all approach to all contracting. I think there's a time and place for most contracting types, but you have to pull each tool out of your toolbox and use them accordingly. That said, I happen to be a strong supporter of well-articulated statement of objectives. And the reason I am is that we have traditionally been so overly prescriptive of detailed statements of work that have been dozens and dozens of pages. And if you're on the contractor side, you realize, particularly if it's a competitive acquisition, you're going to be penalized if you don't pare it back exactly what we had asked for. The sad part is that the trade space is completely lost in that paradigm. We lose the idea of what actually is in the realm of the possible by thinking that we have that we are the only ones that know what's possible out there. So the statement of objectives, again, is, I would use the term liberating, because it explores the full parameters of what is possible. And sometimes that allows us to completely change the initial assumptions that we had when we started the whole process. It also is a lot easier to simply explain what the end state is that we're looking for, and allow the creative spirits of industry to show what's possible. So I do believe that. Why are we not doing it? When you talk to those that I think are well positioned to reap the benefits of this, in my experience, the number one reason is fear. There is a fear from the program office that they are going to lose control, and of the functions that they have responsibility for. They just don't feel that they can trust the process, even though I personally believe that they can and should. And this is an area where I think well-placed feedback from you, from industry, can help illustrate I think this very strong, powerful benefits that can accrue from this approach. So we've got to find a way to attack that fear factor here. And the factor, I've seen it repeatedly in my career. And So I think illustrating case studies where it could have went one way, but we chose to go through the statement of objective approach. It would be even fascinating to hear a company that wasn't successful, but still realized it was beneficial, because even there's lessons learned even from an unsuccessful foray into a competitive acquisition that can be applied to something else. So it's going to be a tough one, but this gets into this risk aversion challenge that I've alluded to earlier.
Yeah, perhaps you could have an annual IC award that recognizes the best statement of objective contract in the last year. And
I actually, those awards are run out of my office, and we're going through those right now. In fact, I'll be getting those tomorrow. So that's a great idea. I will put that on.
Yeah, you shine a spotlight on examples of what you want people to do, and people will follow. Which gets me to the workforce issue. You mentioned a little bit. You said you're looking across the board, 20% under strength, and I know it's not just under strength, but I also understand that a lot of the acquisition workforce is also junior, so there's not as much experience there as well. These are some tough fundamental challenges for a manager trying to do acquisition. What are you doing to tackle this?
So I think there's several ingredients here. One is we've got to understand what's driving the retention problem, and it's not too surprising, and it's not unique to this, but as you can imagine, most of the contracting workforce has very marketable skills. Mm-hmm. So the COVID, I don't want to keep pointing to COVID repeatedly, but that has certainly aggravated this. We have an uneven situation across the IC about telework options. We have some that have embraced it because of the nature of their work. It was pretty easy for them to have lots of unclassified work at home, and they come in perhaps once a week and are able to successfully get what they need done. NGA is a good example of that. We have others where they've got a footprint of different buildings in the metro area or whatever part of the country that their contracting workforce is, and they're able to help alleviate some of the employee concerns by allowing them to work at different locations. And then you have other places like the one I come from, CIA, where there's very little that you can do at home currently. So one is we're exploring contract writing tools that can be done at unclassified level that could be blended into things that can't be done at an unclassified level to create further options there. When it comes to one of the other reasons that's not COVID related, that's high on the list of our retention issue, it's actually frustration with archaic tools. And when we have a different demographic group than the one I come from, they have a high expectation these days, and they realize, they talk to their peers that are outside of government, and they realize that, wow, we're languishing in a really frustrating set of arcane tools that is something that frankly is not something they want to be part of. So we've got to address that side of it too. So one of the I say easy, but one of the first steps that we're tackling, we have 4 Tiger teams that we set up. I just briefed this to the Dexcom on Tuesday to give them a status update. But one of the concrete things that we're doing is we've identified what the skill gap is, the skills gap in the contracting workforce. So it is not necessarily that there's universal dearth of contracting knowledge for for the workforce that we do have. It's very specialized areas that we have been able to identify. Mm-hmm. So one of the things is, if I can accelerate that, buttressing that experience, then at least with the workforce that we do have, I can get them on a glide slope to where they need to be much quicker than it otherwise would be. One of the good things is, with 18 agencies, there is a wonderful range of excellent training that is out there, but we're not sharing it with each other. So one of the first things I want to do, and it's going to be on an unclassified basis, is simply take the training modules that are already there, particularly on-demand training, which is pretty easy to do. I've got agreements from DHS's Procurement Innovation Lab and Defense Acquisition University as just 2 examples, and make that training available to everyone. So I think most agencies are doing a pretty good job of what I would call the foundational level of training. It's the more advanced specialized training that it seems to be uneven. At least there's some that do an excellent job and some that are lacking. It's much more than just that, though. I think it has to do with how we integrate as a team. So I would like to not just ease the access of on-demand training, but I would like to reintroduce things that used to be something I did a quarter century ago, and that's integrate the training with your technical counterparts. When you understand the role of the other party, it changes the way you approach your own job. So sometimes some of the most intriguing part of that training is you do role reversals, where the contracting officer becomes the COTR and the COTR becomes the contracting officer. I think this is some of the things will take some time to reap the benefits of it, but it's an important aspect of building that comprehensive team and understanding the interdependencies between these important roles.
Hey, you mentioned we're starting to get a lot of great questions coming from the audience, so I'm just going to start to ask you some of them. One is from Bruce Green, and you had mentioned, Scott, the pandemic, of course, and his question is, what acquisition best practices emerged during the pandemic that we would like to continue on a long-term basis? And so did we learn some things during the pandemic that we want to continue to implement and expand on?
I think one of the clearest ones that I've seen, and I mentioned it earlier, is historically everything I've been experienced with, we've said everything, if the statement of work is classified, the whole contract has to be classified at the exact same level. And I said that simply was not an option in many cases during the pandemic. So it forced us to take a hard look at every aspect of the work. And by realizing that, wow, there actually are parts that there's no reason they ever have to be at the classified level. It is some parts of it. And that when we take that look, and that is a cultural change and one that many are uncomfortable with or have been uncomfortable with, that's a fundamental game changer, because when you actually change who can actually do the work, there's some individuals that will never get clearances. There's some that never want to get a clearance even. And we have completely changed the marketplace, and that's beneficial, not just from a cost perspective, but reaping the skill sets, the talent, the imaginative solutions that we previously would have been lacking. I know there's been a lot of interest on clearance questions, which is not my immediate forte, but it changes the whole concept of who needs to have clearances. And that is a historical stumbling block for so many programs where we're competing against ourselves with a zero-sum game, where predictably, when you have a fixed supply and rising demand, you increase cost, but you also increase frustration levels. You increase friction between contractors, and we increase friction amongst ourselves, not just between different agencies within the IC, but even within the same agency. So
yeah, I like this idea of trying to structure the contracts where more work can be unclassified. You would intuitively think that could be also lower cost because there's a premium you pay for classified work in a classified workspace. So what, is somebody tackling that, trying to really, again, focus on ways to encourage increased portion of contract work to be done in an unclassified outside of the SCIF, and then also maybe even by uncleared personnel outside of the SCIF, and that would also broaden the availability of labor and could also help hold down cost a bit.
Absolutely. I think we're only on the tip of the iceberg. I do think this is not a phenomenon that's going to recede when hopefully we're done with COVID for the foreseeable future. So I think this is inevitable that this will continue, just like the private sector workplace is, I think, permanently changed about whether it's a hybrid approach or individuals working from home. I think we're not going to go back. So as far as I mentioned 4 Tiger teams, we have 1 covering policy, and this is a topic that's front and center into what they're covering. So I just think we have so many more outlets where we need to do this. We need to also be careful that there is an integration aspect when you do break the contract like that, and there is security concerns that we need to be mindful of. So it's a balancing act, and there will probably be forever some contracts where we're not able to do this, but I think there's quite a few where we can. And I think it's inevitable. It's part of the future, but it's something that we're actively integrating into this reimagining acquisition process.
Great. Hey, back to some other questions. We have a press question here from Justin Doubleday, who's with Federal News Network. He asked, how is ODNI balancing classification and cybersecurity requirements with the imperative to work with commercial tech companies?
I think that is a segue, a perfect segue from the last question. We know that I mentioned quantum computing just a moment ago. You can think about additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, even blockchain. All of these, the actions happening at the unclassified level, clearly. We have technologies that have dual, or I would even say multi-use potential to them. So we know that this is the space that we need to be actively involved in. So we are, through areas like In-Q-Tel, through IARPA, through broad agency announcements, and the CIA labs, just as a few examples, we are increasingly creating, hopefully, an atmosphere where it'll be easier for these entities to contract with us. So I think we have to, at the same time, be mindful that there needs to be a pathway that when we do have aspects of these technologies that does have a classified trajectory to them, that we build a pathway to be able to integrate that. And that's something that we always, sometimes we get so excited with the advanced technology that we, in the back of our mind, we need to be, I think, simultaneously thinking about, okay, that's great, but if it gets to where we need it to be with the level of maturity, how do we actually integrate that? So we've got to get the right parties talking to each other early, even for those that do fail, which we talked about earlier. That is healthy to have some failures into this and learn something from them, but we've got to think holistically about how we're going to do that. So I think there's a role for actually a lot of the companies on this call to help bridge that gap when we have companies that are unaccustomed to dealing either with the federal government or especially the classified parts of the intelligence community. You can help be that bridge to help integrate all the tremendous historical knowledge that you have in a way that's helpful for them. So I think I see a lot of teaming potential opportunities here.
Great. Hey, I wanted to loop back to something you said earlier in your opening comments, which is the first time I've heard of SCIF as a service. And I thought, hey, that's good, because INSA, of course, reflects the industry partners that support the work across the IC, and there's so many small companies in that mix. And SCIFs and small companies, there's a barrier there. A lot of small companies lack their own SCIFs, and that can cause challenges to work with the IC. So can you talk a little bit more about that issue and what ODNI and the IC is doing to address it, and perhaps the SCIF as a service is part of that?
Sure. That's good to clarify, because I talk about this topic every day, and I need to be reminded that this is a topic that I probably need to define first for those unfamiliar. There may be some companies on the line that actually are doing this, but SCIF as a service is, in that definition, is something relatively new, but it's basically, there's a couple of variations to it, and I am encouraging the freedom for industry to experiment with different business models. But in a nutshell, there's a tangible example that NRO helped sponsor, and NGA has done in Chantilly, and a second one in St. Louis. There's other business models creeping up in the country. There's one in Dayton, Ohio coming. It's basically a hoteling concept, but dealing with classified space. So a company either purchases or leases a building and then creates subleases for different levels of space needs. So we have concrete examples because we're following this as a pilot, the one that was done in Chantilly. But what's exciting is that one of the perennial challenges, particularly small companies, but not exclusively small companies, is does it make sense to invest in a skip space when you don't even have a contract yet? And if I were a prudent financial advisor to some company, I probably would say no, that doesn't make sense. So then it's like the chicken and the egg problem of how do you actually break into this area when you have to take this huge risk, and then you might not be successful either at all or for a while, and you have this huge sunk cost. So the beauty of skip as a service is by this hoteling feature, you can actually sublease just as much space as you need and have that grow proportionate to what your needs are. So we've had real cases where small companies started with 1 seat and then said, well, we can use 2 seats now. Now we're up to a whole suite. And we actually have seen a situation where the same small company that leased an office suite within this skip as a service building finally was successful in capturing some contracts and said, it's time for us to look at getting our own space. And they did just that. So it's a renewable feature of this that just like any hoteling that you see, like WeWork and other models out there, it is a revolving door. The other part is, even though we need to encourage it here, I'm a cheerleader for it myself, and we do the accreditation and authorization role in it, we walk away because it's a relationship between the contractor that owns or controls the space and the company that's subleasing it. So this does not involve government out funding.
Good. Hey, another question from a listener, from Maria Sazanowski with Rebellion Defense. She asked, how are you rethinking software contracts to ensure that incentives are aligned between the government and industry?
I'm trying to think of what would be unique about software contracts versus contracts in general on that question, because I think aligning those incentives is important. One of the things that historically is, in my experience, has been the case with a lot of software contracts is we did them level of effort just as a default. And it's easy that way. I talked about the trust factor that we have to work on in some cases, but you're buying a bunch of bodies. And obviously the incentive, if you're a contractor, is you want to fill those positions, but there's not a huge benefit to adding greater functionality that really means something to us. It happens, of course, but you're not incentivized to do that. If it's an award fee contract, your incentives in some experiences have been the extent to which you fulfill all the level of effort, not the net benefits that accrue from the software that you're actually building. So I think we have to look at models that at least are completion based. I do like building incentives in, whether it be incentive fees or award fees, and match that criteria in a way that parallels the things that are meaningful and that actually enhance mission. So I think we do that sometimes very well, but sometimes we do it very poorly. So I do believe in the thrust of the question of aligning those. The other part is this discovery of what's important to the contractor, because we think that we sometimes, even in the award scenarios, we create what we think is the perfect incentivizing feature, and lo and behold, from the contractor's perspective, it doesn't really incentivize the behavior from their end. So I think we've got to have that dialogue and strike the balance between the two parties of what makes the most sense and keep us aligned.
Great. Hey, we have a question here from Rod Azama with the Chancellor Group. And Rod asks, since you're up at the IC level looking across everything, this is a great question for you. Do Intel agencies' acquisition processes differ significantly? And if so, which are particularly effective and why? And are there best practices that can be shared and promulgated throughout to the other IC agencies?
So I'm going to be a little careful on this one because I do have the press on here and I could get in big trouble based on the way I answer this one. First part of the question is, do they differ? They indeed do differ. And that's one of the most striking things that I became increasingly aware of when I joined this position. And that's one of the reasons I took the position, actually, was to learn that. I would say that the DoD-oriented agencies are fundamentally different in a lot of ways. I think there still is a lot of common threads between all 18 agencies, but the way that they operate, they have the DFARS, as many of us know. The way they handle set-asides is in some cases different. The other one that comes to mind that's pretty different is Department of Energy is largely contracting through the national labs. So that is a fundamentally different work, and everything is published unclassified. So you can go and look on one of the national labs and see pretty much all the contracts that Department of Energy is contemplating, or they even have ones up for renewal that you can actually look and see that. You will never see that probably in my lifetime at CIA or NRO. But there's other ways to see what's being contemplated. Okay. So those are just some basic differences. It's interesting because it gets in when I meet with the other agencies, the things that they talk about as major innovations are very different. Like how you innovation for one agency, I won't name it, was something about how it encouraged small businesses, which is noble, but it's very different than what someone else would talk about. So.
Well, back to the idea of innovation and innovators, we have a question here from Patrick Wilson of MediaTek. They're a semiconductor company. He asked, many leading edge technology companies avoid government procurement process because it's complicated and time consuming. How can the IC make the government market more appealing to the innovators whose technologies are so critical?
So, first of all, I'm very sympathetic with that concern. I understand, it makes total sense to me. I talked earlier about, I think understanding the root cause is important to figure out what is the reason behind that and ways that we can address it specifically. For those situations where we'll never be able to get comfortable with a FAR-based contract, the increasing range of options, I talked earlier about the other transactional authority and the CSO capability that DoD has, are two relatively new pathways that allow for, a more traditional commercial contract setup. So I think along with that, besides the different contracting mechanisms, there has to be an educational level, particularly with data rights and other intellectual property, because it's treated very differently in those contracts than it historically is with the FAR-based contracts. And that's part of the acumen, what I would call the tradecraft acumen, that we have to help our workforce understand that you can actually have a different posture than you're used to and still meet our needs. And when you think about the dual use technologies, I think that's increasingly going to be important, because there's other ways that we can accomplish what we want and still allow a company to preserve the intellectual property rights that they want to understandably maintain.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. This one is from Ron Carback with CACI, and Ron asks, can you share how individual agencies can decrease time from RFI market survey to award?
Well, so I'll tell you a little bit. One of the roles that I have is when something reaches the Director Haynes's attention, call on me to figure out what happened. And so we had, and I'll use this as a case study, sort of. So we had I'm not going to say the agency, but correctly, this agency realized that they had a capability that could be done as a commercial contract. So for those in the contracting field, they did it as a Part 12 FAR-based contract. They did some of the right things. They did an RFI, they did market research. But the problem is that they kind of lapsed back into their old habits once all that was done. And when it came to something very basic, and I'll just use this as an example, how to price this, instead of embracing a well-defined commercial pricing paradigm, that market research, it's easy for me to critique them afterwards because I wasn't involved in it. But I think a little more thorough market research would have revealed that there was a commercial pricing model out there that we could have embraced without sacrificing any equities that would have been detrimental to us. That little fact of non-embracing the commercial model, we ended up having the agency involved did, I think, 3 separate amendments to the RFP just to help align what the comfort level of what industry was perplexed with what the government was willing to accept. And that added, I think it was at least 60 days right there. That's just one example, but I think it's that spirit of doing that market research ahead of time to know how we should structure things in a way that not just meets the government's needs, but is compatible with what industry is comfortable with. And if we do a better job at that, I think that's one example of how we compress this. I think I talked earlier about doing the training where we jointly do some of our training with the contracting officers and their counterparts. Building that team relationship is another important thing. Sadly, a lot of times for run-of-the-mill acquisitions now, the principal means of communications is emails. They don't even meet face-to-face. And I think that even if we have telework capabilities, we've got to preserve that integrated approach, because when you are talking to each other regularly, we get rid of all of those back and forth iterative steps that don't add any value typically and prolong the process unnecessarily. And I think just bridging those misunderstandings fast is just one of the easiest things that we can do to help. The other thing is, anyway, I could come with 12 other ones, but.
Well, we're out of time for today, so we'll have to maybe revisit those at another time. Any closing thoughts, Scott, before we say goodbye?
Well, I thank everyone's attention this morning. As you can tell, this is a multifaceted challenge, and to do this, we're not going to be successful if we try to do it in isolation. So I really need your help, and there'll be outlets to reach out to me directly if you wish. But I look forward to continued engagement with each of you going forward, and we're all in this together. And
great. Well, thank you for joining us today and for all of your insights and comments. And once again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, SAIC, for supporting today's program. And to everybody who joined us online, thanks for joining us today. When the webinar ends, there will be a short survey that pops up. Please take a few moments to complete it and let us know how we did. Looking ahead, on Wednesday, June 8th, INSA will hold a leadership dinner with DoD CIO John Sherman at the Hilton McLean Tyson's Corner, and his remarks and Q&A will focus on a range of topics, including the department's digital modernization strategy, CMMC, Zero Trust, efforts to protect the DIB, and more. It's going to be a great evening, and we have former DIA Director Bob Ashley leading the fireside chat. So it's going to be a great, by all accounts. Also, thinking about small businesses, we talked about them some today. On June 14th through 16th, INSA will have its Diversifying the DIB Small Business National Security Showcase. We'll have 2 days of virtual events designed to look at what contractors, small contractors are doing. And then we'll also have a one day, the last day, we'll have a celebration reception that features CIA's Director of Digital Futures, Randy Nixon, who'll be making remarks. The program is gratis, but we do need you to register in advance. And finally, earlier this week, we opened registration for the new IC Empowering Women and Engaging Men Symposium, which will take place on July 14th at the Army Navy Country Club in Arlington. We have a full day planned, including opening keynote from DNI Avril Haynes and closing remarks by NGA Deputy Director Tanya Wilkerson. Plus, there'll be panels, ignite rounds, collaborative breakout sessions, and of course, networking throughout the day. You can learn about these and all of our events on INSA's website, insaonline.org. This concludes this morning's program. Have a wonderful day.